Bonjour et bienvenue à tous et à toutes. Nous sommes heureux de vous accueillir à la première session de la série Boîte à outils en sciences humaines numériques. Je suis Jada Watson, coordonnatrice des sciences humaines numériques à l'Université d'Ottawa. Good morning and welcome to the first session of the Digital Humanities Toolbox series. I'm Jada Watson, coordinator of Digital Humanities at the University of Ottawa, and I'm delighted to be hosting the fifth year of Toolbox workshops. In our first workshop, Dr. Mary Arseneau and Roxanne Lafleur are going to share their work on the Christina Rossetti in Music project. Before we begin today, I want to start our session with an Indigenous land affirmation. Nous rendons hommage au peuple algonquin, gardien traditionnel de cette terre. Nous reconnaissons le lien sacré de longue date, l'unissant à ce territoire qui demeure non cédé. Nous rendons également hommage à tous les peuples autochtones qui habitent Ottawa, qu'ils soient de la région ou d'ailleurs au Canada. Nous reconnaissons les gardiens des savoirs traditionnels, jeunes et âgés. Nous honorons aussi leurs courageux dirigeants d'hier, d'aujourd'hui et de demain. We pay respect to the Algonquin people who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders past, present, and future. I'm so delighted to be starting this year's series with two good friends who are in charge of the Christina Rossetti in Music project. Le projet Christina Rossetti en musique a été lancé il y a 5 ans dans le but d'identifier et de cataloguer tous les arrangements musicaux de textes connus de la poétesse Christina Georgina Rossetti et de jeter ainsi les bases de nouveaux champs d'investigation dans les études sur Rossetti. In this workshop, Dr. Mary Arseneau and Roxanne Lafleur will discuss the evolution of the project, share some surprising discoveries, and how this unique online archive is changing how we interpret the work of this Victorian female poet. Mary Arseneau is a professor in the Department of English at the University of Ottawa. She's the author of Recovering Christina Rossetti, Female Community and Incarnational Poetics, co-editor of The Culture of Christina Rossetti, Female Poetics in Victorian Contexts, and annotator of the Cove Online edition of Goblin Market, and author of numerous journal articles and book chapters. She is currently leading the SSHRC-funded Christina Rossetti in Music Research Project, which is studying music settings of poems by Christina Rossetti and creating an open access online catalog and archive of these compositions. In her 33 years at the University of Ottawa Library, Roxanne Lafleur has managed image collections and provided users with reference assistance. She was instrumental in the implementation of the library's digital image collections and as a member of the Art Store Institutional Advisory Group, which contributed to the creation of Shared Shelf, which is now known as JSTOR Forum. As a digital humanities support specialist in the library, she provides guidance, assistance, and training primarily in the areas of digital exhibit curation, custom cataloging, and imaging. She collaborates on several research and student-led digital projects, including the Christina Rossetti in Music project. So I'm going to turn this screen over to my colleagues in a moment, but just wanted to let you know that if you have questions, you can use the Q&A or the chat function. We will get to every question, I promise. I do often just wait until there's a natural break so that I'm not interrupting the presentation. So please go ahead and don't hold back and ask any questions you have. And without further ado, I turn it over to my colleagues, Mary and Roxanne.
Thank you very, very much, Jada. I want to thank you for inviting us to talk about this project. And thank you to Roxanne for coming up with the title for this talk, Discovering Christina Rossetti in Music, because it really conveys both the aim of today's talk, as we want to share with you this project and allow you to discover Christina Rossetti in music, but it also captures the original origins of this project. I've been studying Christina Rossetti since writing my doctoral dissertation on her. And I've been studying the préraphaélite movement, which was a movement in literary and visual arts that began in 1848. Musical settings of Christina Rossetti's poems were really not on my radar until very recently, and it began really by pure accident. My children were singing, and each year they'd sing a different Christina Rossetti musical setting by a really good composer. And they were really good songs. And it just, after this happened for several years in a row, and they're singing them solo pieces and with choirs, I thought, how many of these are there? And so I started looking. And at first I thought there might be a few hundred of these. Well, we've already cataloged 1,500 and they're on our Omeka website. And we have about another 500 at the back end ready to be cataloged, cleaned up, and published as well. So we're approaching 2,000 musical settings. And the thing that we know for a fact is that we have not found everything that's already been written. This is sort of exploded into being a much bigger topic than I was expecting. And that's really great because it's a whole new line of inquiry in Christina Rossetti studies, and it extends outward to all pre-Raphaelite poetry for, William Morris, Swinburne, Dante Gabriel Rossetti. All of these poets have had their poems set to music. And what we're also discovering is that this is a huge part of the interpretation, dissemination, and global spread of pre-Raphaelite poetry. And it carries it into the modern day. I'm jumping ahead to a later topic, but I mean, when James Blake records a cover of In the Bleak Midwinter and distributes it in 2020, you think, okay, so this is still going on today. And what we're aware of too is that new settings are written all the time. So we know we have not found everything yet. Very quickly, when we started this project, we discovered useful bibliographical sites or sources. Gooch and Thatcher's 1979 catalog of musical settings of early and mid-Victorian literature. Then we discovered LiterNet, Emily Zust's online resource, which records the text for musical settings of poems. We discovered the hymns on hymnary.org. And then Maura Ives, who's also a project collaborator, published her descriptive bibliography of Christina Rossetti in 2011. And this included a valuable section on hymns and secular musical settings of Christina Rossetti's poems, but only up to 1900. So what we very quickly discovered was that there were resources, but no one resource was complete. And we still believe that a complete archive is a very useful resource for having a critical conversation so that everybody can sort of begin with the same resources available. So at the beginning, I thought I was going to come up with a bibliography of Christina Rossetti musical settings. And I have to confess, I was not tuned in to digital humanities at that time. But as I became aware of it, I thought, no, this is the real resource that we need. Because what I quickly discovered was that the musical scores are scattered around the world. And it's really hard and time consuming to get your hands on the scores. And we really can't talk about the importance of these musical settings unless we can study them in detail and compare them to each other and understand the musical scene and musical culture and musical development more. So this is a service to Christina Rossetti studies and pre-Raphaelite studies, really, because what I really want to do is to start a critical conversation that many, many can participate in. Now, Christina Rossetti and pre-Raphaelite scholars have traditionally been inter-art because the pre-Raphaelite movement was an inter-art movement from the beginning in the literary and visual arts. They, for instance, would study double works of art, paintings that were depicting poems, illustrated books where the pictures are used to illustrate the poem that was written, paired poems and paintings. Think of The Blessed Damozel or The Girlhood of Mary Virgin, where there is a poem written and a painting depicting it. There are even pre-Raphaelite paintings that have poems written onto the frames that were custom designed for the painting. So the inter-art boundaries were blurred for for Pre-Raphaelite art and their conception of what art can do right from the beginning. The thing that had escaped my notice was that by 1860, Pre-Raphaelite poetry had ventured into the field of music as well. And it's a huge topic. And the expanse of this body of work comes as a surprise to me, but that makes it all the more necessary to gather it, because frankly, today, very few people pick up a volume of poems and read it, but we all encounter music every day, so that most people who encounter Christina Rossetti's poetry encounter it through the vehicle of music. And this is how it has largely spread around the world. And I'll talk more about methodology in a minute, but every setting interprets the poem. It's inevitable, cannot be avoided. So this project really began with a recognition of the value and need to expand the interdisciplinary scope of Pre-Raphaelite studies to include music. For musical settings remain the most critically overlooked aspect of the interpretation, reception, and global dissemination of Pre-Raphaelite poetry and Christina Rossetti's poetry. And Christina Rossetti's poetry has been set to music more frequently than any other Pre-Raphaelite poet's works. And we tend to think of the original Pre-Raphaelite brothers as being the main stars, but Christina Rossetti's poetry attracts composers and is really well adapted to be sung. And so it moves into that mellow poetic hybridity very, very nicely. The neglect of this body of work can be in part due to the disciplinary silos that separate music studies from textual studies. There are very few people who are as conversant in both disciplines, and so therefore can really adequately address the hybrid work of a song or a cantata or any kind of other musical genre where there's text and music. My sense is that we need a sustained examination of the history of Pre-Raphaelitism that is motivated by a focus on music. The Pre-Raphaelite movement is very well documented, primarily through William Michael Rossetti's, and this is Dante Gabriel Rossetti and Christina Rossetti's brother, William Michael, who was one of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood and the real main record keeper of the movement, as well as of his brother and sister's poetical careers. And William Michael Rossetti's diaries, letters, memoirs, and editions are invaluable sources of information, and we rely on them completely. But what came to my attention as I began researching this topic is that his documents tend to downplay music and underrepresent music's presence within the Pre-Raphaelite circle. Now, every narrator writes from his or her own perspective, and William Michael was not particularly knowledgeable about or interested in music. And the result is that music is considerably and not justifiably obscured in the Pre-Raphaelite record. As an example, in his volumes, Some Reminiscences, William Michael admits, quote, "Having other occupations which absorbed my time and attention, I have never learned anything about musical art in detail." And in his diary, he admits, "So far as my ignorance of music allows an opinion." I suggest that it is essential that we take William Michael at his word and recognize the fact that the current record regarding music and the Pre-Raphaelites is incomplete, and it is at times also incorrect. Examples about William Michael's silence about music can be revealed by simply reading beyond his own narrative. For instance, William Michael's diaries and reminiscences record very little of Ford Madox Brown's fortnightly parties over an 8-year period beginning in 1866. Meanwhile, other guests did take note of the consistent presence of music at these events. For example, in his memoir of his grandfather, novelist Ford Madox Ford describes how Madox Brown and his wife Emma regularly sang at these evenings, accompanied by Kathy, their daughter, who would later marry Francis Hoofer, and also noting that at these gatherings, Music was represented by Theo Marzials and Dr. Hoofer, who championed the music of the future in those past days. Marzials was a poet, professional singer, and a composer who set four of Christina Rossetti's poems, and whose setting of A Birthday was among the most popular of Rossetti's settings and a bestseller in the 19th century, published 8 different times by publishers in the UK, the United States, and in Australia, I believe. Even more significantly, Frances Hoofer was prominent both in the Preraphaelite circle and the much larger musical world. Hoofer was Ford Madox Brown's son-in-law, for he married Kathy. He was William Michael Rossetti's brother-in-law, for William married Lucy, their other daughter. Hoofer was a musicologist, composer of 3 settings of Christina Rossetti poems. He was also a music critic for The Times, the editor of Musical World, author of several books relating to music, and Dante Gabriel Rossetti's neighbor in Cheyne Walk, librettist for several English operas by prominent English composers. Hoofer was also Dante Gabriel's collaborator for a planned but unrealized opera or choral drama called The Doom of the Sirens, a lyrical tragedy, for which Dante Gabriel composed a prose sketch outlining the dramatic events for the libretto. And Hoofer was also the editor of the Tauchnitz edition of Dante Gabriel Rossetti's poetry. And this was the edition that would be the source for Claude Debussy's influential setting, The Blessed Damozel, a composition that marked Debussy's emergence as the most significant young French composer of his day, and also helped establish appreciation for the Preraphaelites in France. The main point here is that a fuller understanding of Preraphaelite musical connections will reveal to us much more about the important social and artistic networks that were facilitated through music. Furthermore, by researching the backstory behind some of William Michael's statements, we discover some errors and inconsistencies. In general, his interest in musical settings appears motivated mostly by personal or family association, or by his own literary interests. He was a huge promoter of the works of Shelley, and that was a big part of his activity in the literary world. But his judgment on music is sometimes questionable. For instance, as Karen Ewan's research has made clear, in 1869, established and well-respected British composer George Alexander Macfarren premiered his cantata setting of Christina's Songs in a Cornfield. Macfarren would later become principal of the Royal Academy of Music and professor of music at Cambridge, and would be knighted in 1883. This premiere of Songs in a Cornfield took place in one of London's largest performance venues of the period, St. James's Hall, and was conducted by renowned musician and conductor Henry Leslie, with leading female vocalists as soloists. It was clearly a significant cultural event. The review in the musical world confirmed its significance in saying that this cantata was, quote, the first of its kind having any pretensions of musical importance, a comment that suggests how this composition anticipates the goals of the English musical Renaissance, a very significant late Victorian development in English music training, composition, and performance. I'm going to go off script for a moment here and point out that William Michael Rossetti hosted in his home a private recital or concert directed by Sir Hubert Parry of his own composition, Scenes of Prometheus Unbound. And this composition has been cited by musicologists as the inaugural event of the English musical Renaissance, a profoundly influential movement in the development of English music in the late Victorian period. William Michael Rossetti, though, was misinformed. He said, I think this is being debuted at my own concert. And that wasn't the truth, because his brother-in-law, Francis Hoofer, had reviewed it when it really debuted in 1880. So all this to say, I think the world of William Michael's work in support of the Preraphaelite movement, but we do have to recognize every storyteller has blind spots, and music is William Michael's. It's one of them. Meanwhile, William Michael underestimates Songs in a Cornfield, to return to my script, saying in his note in the poetical works of Christina Rossetti, "I believe it did not take much with the public." This conclusion is really inconsistent with the publishing history of the work, for individual solo songs from the cantata were published separately. Multiple new editions of the entire cantata were issued. The work remained in print up to 1894 and was performed and reviewed regularly. Tellingly, in 1870, the year following the work's premiere, it was republished by Novello in a prestigious ottavo edition in the illustrious company of Mendelssohn's music composed for Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream and Handel's Acis and Galatea, a serenata. So to be published alongside Mendelssohn and Handel the year after a work's debut suggests that Songs with a Cornfield did harvest a lot of recognition and esteem, right after its emergence. William Michael Rossetti edited the first collected edition of Christina's poems, and although his edition does pay some attention to musical settings, it underestimates the number of them that existed. William Michael's notes on musical settings of Christina's poems in poetical works of 1904 remark on the existence of 43 musical settings of her poems. Meanwhile, Maura Ives's bibliography lists 172 settings, excluding those published in hymnals before 1900. So all this to say, in summary, well-intentioned and dedicated as he is, we cannot assume that the facts regarding music that are stated by William Michael are reliably accurate. So where do we go from here? Well, I'm going to pass the baton to Roxanne, who's going to talk a little bit about the technical challenges that we faced with our project. And I will admit my ignorance at the outset. I first thought I could sort of record all this data and metadata in an Excel spreadsheet. And that didn't really work, as it kind of exploded in all directions off the screen. And then I went to the Digital Humanities Summer Institute thinking, okay, maybe I need to code and create a tool for doing all of this. And that's not really in my wheelhouse. So I went to Roxanne, and she's been the savior who gave us the digital framework that we really needed to do this effectively. So over to you, Roxanne.
Thank you, Mary. Yes, so when we started talking about the project, it became obvious to me that we needed some out-of-the-box solutions, not build everything from scratch. And we had already been using Omeka with different projects through the library. But Omeka is a little limiting in the sense that the schema that it offers to catalog items is Dublin Core, which is constituted by 15 elements. We had a lot of very specific information to capture, and so we needed to create our own custom schema. But we also needed to find a tool that would allow us to catalog items efficiently and in a user-friendly manner. So we looked at JSTOR, and we've been familiar with it for a very long time when it used to be called Shared Shelf. And it allowed us, and I'm going to just show you a slide here of what it looks like today. It has changed through the years a little bit. It allows us to create custom schemas, be able to upload files, to then publish directly into Omeka. So this is what it looks like if you happen to be an administrator, because there are different levels of permission. This is another thing that was important to us, is not to give access to the whole database to anyone who comes and works with us, because if they click the delete button, it's gone forever. Or if they make a change, how would we know that they made a change? So we needed a robust tool that could allow us to give very different types of levels of access. And if you can see here at the bottom right, you'll see the total of records that we have so far in JSTOR. Now, this is a little false because there are some duplication in there, but we definitely have close to 1,600 already in the database. This is what it looks like when we open an actual record. And as you can see, we have boxes in which we can type. We can also produce lists and pick terms out of that list, which is very, very important because we want to use some of that terminology to produce tags. And we certainly don't want the words to be misspelt or have punctuation, unnecessary punctuation, etc. Now, each of these fields have a little eye above it. You can see it right here. And when you click on those, you actually get a little bubble that tells you what that field is about and examples of what it actually does, or examples of how it should be manifested. And this is very helpful for the cataloger to be able to quickly remind themselves of how the information should be captured. So let me just go to the next slide here. So now about the cataloging schema, because any data is only as good as the way you organize it. And you might find 74 fields a bit extreme, but there's a lot of duplication in there because we have sometimes more than one creator, more than one composer, more than one lyricist, or more than one actual version of the actual setting. So we had to adapt, we had to find creative ways of capturing all of that. So within those 74, 12 of those fields inside of that have more than one iteration, if you will. They have more than one box to capture separate values. Out of all of that, we also have 17 control vocabulary lists, things like genre, like the list of poems. And so that really helps us, again, capturing that information without making spelling mistakes or just not capturing it in the format that we want. These records are then published directly into Omeka because Forum offers an Omeka API. That's actually quite recent. There was a plugin before that that wasn't as robust. What it allows us to do now, which is so wonderful, is that you can publish something, make changes on the Omeka site, not on the metadata, but on any other thing, tags, files, etc. And if there's a change to be made, we do it on the JSTOR forum level, and then we push it back, we republish it into Omeka, and it just cleans up, if you will. It updates the information on the Omeka item. This, as I mentioned several times, allows us to make tags. And also there's an option in Omeka that if any of you use Omeka, you might not know about this plugin. It allows us to link items together. We have song cycles, for example, which are larger works, and we want them to relate to one another. We want the viewer to be able to go click on the other setting that is part of that cycle. And we have seen settings where they're just Rossetti poems, others that have a mix with other composers. And so we have that option of linking those items. So let me just show you very quickly what the schema looks like. So on the left, you see Dublin core, the 15 elements, and we don't even use all 15. So that means we're squeezing 74 fields into less than 13 fields. And so here we have the list. You can see how long it is in description. But what's so powerful about JSTOR Forum and the mapping system is I can add prefixes. So I can introduce that information with a descriptor that allows the viewer, the visitor to our website, to understand what that information is all about. It's very, very important when you have lists, because you don't necessarily want to create a sentence, but you want them to understand what it means. So the perfect example is the Christina Rossetti poem. And you would see this particular term with a hyphen and then the poem to which it is the musical setting is all about. All the tags that you see here, the word tags, those are the fields we actually tag. And some of it needs a little cleaning up, others is just copy paste and dump it in. So very powerful. This is some more of those fields. And here you see the subject, all tags. But as you can see, it has genre. They're all lists, by the way. And then you have solo and other versions. So for solo, chorus, vocal, ensemble, instrumentation, sharps and flats, we have the main entry, and then we have 3 possible versions, because sometimes we have other versions. Maybe it's a solo and piano version, or maybe it's a solo and orchestra, or maybe it's in a different voice range. And so that's the way we capture it. Now, when we created all of this, it was important that we created for the means of multidisciplinary means. In other words, we wanted it as much for the people in music who want to find information that is music centric, and those who are in the literary side. Now, most of the people working with us are students in English Lit. And so they're not, they don't necessarily have the knowledge of how to decipher a musical score. So one perfect example of this is the sharps and flats. Instead of asking, put in the key in which this is sung, we just capture the numbers of flats or sharps that appear at the very beginning of the setting. Sometimes it changes, but we don't capture that. We just capture the beginning. It just sets the tone. Sorry, that was a bit of a pun, I just realized. But it just sets, it gives you an indication of the mood of the music, perhaps, especially for someone in music. I know a little bit about music, high school, we're going back a few decades here. And so I don't always get it, but for someone in music, it could be quite meaningful. So this is very important. Also, all of this data we hope will be helpful to generate data analysis in the future. So this could be very helpful to bring those settings together. Yeah, okay. So you'll notice at the bottom, I have 4 fields that are not mapped to Dublin Core. So the beauty with JSTOR Forum, I don't have to publish all of them. So we have fields that are for administration purposes only, including an area for students to write comments when they're actually entering the data. Now, on the Omeka side, if you know Omeka, you know that there are a lot of out-of-the-box solutions, right? You can browse by item, browse by collection, browse by exhibit. We've turned all of those out. We basically have created simple pages and control the way that people can browse, because we wanted it more robust than what Omeka could offer. It also offers the exhibit tool, and we use it under a heading called commentary, where we provide context to specific settings and thus promoting the scholarship. And we hope to be adding more to that. And Professor Mary will be talking a little bit about that later and give you some examples. We also have a Twitter account that you can join, by the way, and we'll put it at the end in our thank you slide. And it's a great way for promoting. That's how we saw it at the beginning. But what we didn't realize is we've actually received quite a few new settings thanks to Twitter, things that have not been published by little known composers. Sometimes they're very well known and other times they're not well known. We don't discriminate. We just want to catalog as much as we can. We also used it to create surveys. So last year we created a little quick survey about what's your favorite A Christmas Carol in the Breakwind Winter setting. And we had a choice of composers, and then we asked them, well, do you know any other? And that generated information that we didn't know. So very helpful. And if you want to see the result of that, we have it in one of our exhibits as well. Now, this is the example of one of those simple pages I was telling you about. This is our browse collection page. And if you go there, you'll see that everything that's in orange is a link to either another page that gives you a list of items. So in Creator, we'll have a list, and it's getting really long, of all the creators, regardless of their role. A list of the poems, a list of instrumentation, voicing, genre, etc. But you'll notice there's also a button called Browse the full list of musical settings. We created an item type within Omeka to capture everything that's published from JSTOR Forum, meaning the musical setting, because we need to isolate them. In Omeka, we also create exhibits, and we create items only within Omeka to create those exhibits. For example, cover of a CD, or the portrait of an individual, pictures of a performance. And so we don't want that mixed up. Had we used the browse items feature that Omeka uses, that would all be mixed in. And so we really wanted a means to isolate that. And Omeka provides a link to that. And that's what we highlighted here. Now, none of this we could ever do without having robust guides, because even I forget what we decided to do with a specific field. And so we have a guide on how to use JSTOR form. We have a guide on cataloging, which includes information about the file, how to manifest it, how to format it, also how to name it. And so to name it, we use an abbreviation of the poem. And to find the abbreviation, we created tables where we have the whole list of poems with the abbreviation, with the first line of the poem, as well as the volume in which it was published. So if we stumble upon a setting and we're not sure of the poem, these are ways that we can navigate through the information. We have a guide on MLA 8th edition with examples that are pertinent to this project. We have the mapping. I did it, but if ever we pass the baton on to another institution and they need to do it in their installation of forum, then they might need to remap that. So it's important that we keep information about all of this. We also have a publication procedure, which tells us exactly what to tag and how to tag it. And we have an example of a score where we actually have little bubbles all over the place that say, by the way, if the name of the person above on the upper left side is probably the lyricist, and on the right side is usually the composer. And this is what you write when you want to enter the copyright statement. And so it just breaks it down, tells them where to find those sharps and flats that I was telling you about. And the title can be confusing sometimes, because sometimes it's part of a bigger piece, or it's part of a collection. And the name of the collection is actually bigger than the name above the score. So little things like that help the new users to catalog. Now, the team is composed, of course, of our principal investigator, Dr. Mary Arseneau. We have two new co-investigators, Dr. Jada Watson, who introduced us and happens to be a musicologist, and Dr. Maura Ives, who Mary also mentioned being a Christina Rossetti scholar. I'm the collaborator, and I take care of everything electronic and cataloging. I tend to warn people all the time, and I'm the one who gives training to the students in the classroom or new assistants. We have two research assistants that have been instrumental in this whole project. Emily McConkey, who's been with us the longest, who actually has an exhibit published within the website if you're interested, and Sarah Pennington, who is instrumental in creating our schema. And then we have other volunteers. We also have student participation, and their contributions are done through the form of coursework in seminars offered by Professor Arseneau in Victorian literature. And so it provides them with those soft skills that they will never encounter any other way unless they take a course that involves that. And it also gives them an idea of how important working with primary sources is, discovering the item, how do you, the what, who, what, where, when, and how of that item. There's research involved in that. And so they're credited, their names appear as catalogers within each item. So we do credit them because there's a lot of work involved there. But it also gives, like I said, those soft skills that are required, and also gives them an idea of how DH can help them in their academic endeavors. None of this would happen without the support of the library, because the Omeka instance is at the library. Our subscription is through the library. And by the way, shared shelf is not something we readily open to our users. This is something they need to go through me. And if it qualifies for their needs, then I need to give access and create individual accounts. So the library is instrumental. We depend greatly. I think half of the scores that we found would not have been found without the help of interlibrary loans. The Copyright Office, we consult on a regular basis. And of course, our research services, very important. We received an inside grant to a bit of a surprise because we didn't think we would get it that quickly. But without that, we would never have been able to hire Emily and to continue this work. We also received a grant from the Faculty of Arts, which was instrumental in getting those two assistants at the same time. And that's actually when we actually got our schema down flat, because we needed to be together and work together. And of course, the composers, the living composers, the individuals, the institutions that not only provided us with material, but also gave us permissions and information. So all very important things to have. And now you're going to hear all about the discoveries, because wow, Mary's only going to go over the few important ones, but there are so many. We email each other constantly about those little things that we discover. And sometimes I stumble upon things and I go, I can't believe I found that. And so on to you, Mary.
I'm coughing and I was looking for a cough drop. They're just allergies. I've taken my allergy meds, and yet I think it's hay fever season. Anyway, so I'm going to talk about the discoveries. And this is, as Roxanne, I'm just going to cherry pick, a few things that we found out and that surprised us. I began with my own path of discovery on this and realizing that there is a theory, and fairly robust and developed theory, about text-music relations. I can read music, but I'm not a musicologist by any means. But what I quickly discovered was that every musical setting is a reading or interpretation of a text. And I wanted to better understand how such interpretations are communicated. So we began really studying how musical gestures supplement textual meanings. We then started looking at the body of material that we were gathering, which was bigger than we knew it was going to be when we began, but it's wonderful how big it is. And we're struck by particular poems that are amazingly popular with composers. Song, When I'm Dead, My Dearest. For instance, there are already 164 entries for that poem in our Omeka website, and we believe there are really close to 200 settings already in existence today. The very first setting of a Christina Rossetti poem was by Alice Mary Smith, and it was of this poem. So she had an instinct right at the beginning that has really stuck with composers. And naively, because it was only 1863 or 4, I assumed that this was a parlor ballad that she had written, because the English song tradition was evolving and changing through these later decades in the 19th century. And so I assumed a female composer writing a song to a kind of sentimental lyric. When I'm dead, my dearest, sing no sad songs for me. That was a parlor ballad. And we have not located the score yet. If anybody knows where that score is, and it was republished and it was still in existence into the 20th century, but we just haven't laid our hands on it yet. I'd love to know what that setting is like, because Alice Mary Smith was not a minor composer. She was the first female composer to compose a symphony that was performed publicly by an orchestra. So she was already a breakthrough figure in the music world. And this is the thing about Christina Rossetti's poems, is if we follow through all the different examples, we see how new audiences are opened up to Christina Rossetti through music. Lo Dayu was a song artist who was a performer as well. He became known as the godfather of Chinese pop music, or Mando pop. And he composed a setting of this piece that ended up that was for a film called The Golden Age. And it was a very successful theatrical release. Today, recently, it's been set by Bear McCreary, who is the composer who scores The Walking Dead, Outlander. He's done some Pirates of the Caribbean, some Battlestar Galactica. He's a major composer. And he describes reading that poem and said, it exploded in my head as music. So he spends his spare time writing a setting of it. And you can find that on the internet and on his blog. In the Bleak Midwinter is a prime example of a very significant poem. And it wasn't significant as a poem. It wasn't until it became a really significant song and Christmas carol that it became so wildly popular. It was published in an American journal, and it wasn't even published in any of Christina Rossetti's volumes of poems until after her death, when it was included in her complete poems. But it was set by Gustav Holst for the English hymnal, 1906. And the connections here to the music world are significant. For the English hymnal is the most influential hymnal in the Anglican Church and the most significant hymnal to come out of the English musical Renaissance. And it was co-edited by Ralph Vaughan Williams and Percy Dermer. So the connections to William Morris, who was a Preraphaelite poet and artist, there's a dense networking that has not been visualized yet. And that's something that our metadata might allow us to capture and map. And it will reveal a new picture of this artistic circle. In the Bleak Midwinter has become a touchstone song. It figures in so many movies and television series, I can't tell you. It appears in Harry Potter, the films. It appears in Peaky Blinders, where it really becomes a touchstone. It's what the soldiers sing together as they're being approached by the enemy and they think they're facing certain death. And they don't die that day. And so the main character says, everything after this is extra. And every time he's moving into a dangerous situation, he goes, in the bleak. It's a significant song. It appears in The Crown. And it's been performed and recorded by so many contemporary popular recording artists, James Taylor, Sarah McLachlan, Annie Lennox, and many, many, many more. And up to the very present time, it's still being recorded by new artists. I've mentioned James Blake, Jacob Collier, who's a really innovative young musician who's already won 4 Grammys before the age of 26 years old, who sings in microtones, has done this microtone harmonic version of In the Bleak Midwinter. So all I'm saying is that this poem lends itself to all kinds of different possibilities. This musical world also, this is Jacob Collier here. Yeah. So there's all kinds of networks that get revealed. Phyllis Welliver's recent scholarship on the Gladstone salons is fascinating, and it shows us how interpersonal connections motivated by music and networks, create. That was really where the origins of the English musical Renaissance can be found, and the Royal College of Music, which was its main institution. Who Has Seen the Wind is a Christina Rossetti poem that has been set so many different times, so many different ways. Excuse me. There's also a critical impact that comes from musical interpretations. And now I want to focus in, I'm going to really narrow down the focus to Goblin Market, which I would argue is Christina Rossetti's most important poem. And it's been set different times by composers. This is only a partial list. We have not finished this exhibit yet. But the very first of these, excuse me, is by Emmanuel Aguilar, whose 1880 cantata was a discovery to me. Aguilar and Christina Rossetti met several times to discuss the libretto, the words that were going to be used in this cantata. And together they changed the text of the poem, and Christina Rossetti gave her explicit authorization to these changes. So what we have in Goblin Market cantata is an authorially approved variant text of Christina Rossetti's first and her most major poem. I was stunned by this. I had never known about it, and I'm not sure that many people had. And interestingly, what these changes revolve around is a desire to take the poem to a juvenile audience and to make it suitable for juvenile performances. But this happened in 1880. In fact, the later part of the 70s, when they were discussing the change of text. And so it anticipates the change of Goblin Market, which Lorraine Jansen Koistra has perceptively called a cross-audienced poem, because it was originally published for adults, but then late in the Victorian period, it moved into the area of children's publication, and we have children's illustrated versions by artists like Arthur Rackham and others. And so it anticipates the change to children's literature that Lorraine Jansen Koistra's book, Christina Rossetti and Illustrations, so importantly chronicles. But if nobody looks at music, we don't realize that there's a meshing of momentum in that direction. So what does Aguilar do to remove the sexual meaning? Well, let's just take a look at some of the changes. For instance, when Lizzie goes to encounter the goblin men to save her sister by bringing home an antidote, look on the right. This is Rossetti's original text. Lizzie, Lizzie, have you tasted for my sake the fruit forbidden? Must your light like mine be hidden? Your young life like mine be wasted? Undone in mine undoing, and ruined in my ruin, thirsty, cankered, goblin-ridden. There's a lot of code language here. Fruit forbidden is, of course, the temptation in the Garden of Eden. But undoing and ruin were Victorian code words for a sexual fall. Think about Thomas Hardy's poem, I've been ruined, don't you know? Where she's describing why she's dressed so finely now. Undone in mine undoing and ruined in my ruin, Laura is worried that Lizzie has undergone a similar fall. But look at what Aguilar does with it. He changes it to a simple allegory of disobedience. Lizzie, Lizzie, have you tasted for my sake the bitter sweetness? Must your life like mine be wasted, maimed and marred before completeness? Tomorrow and tomorrow still waking us to sorrow, goblin haunted, driven, daunted. So it's about disobedience and the lack of full maturation into your own best potential that this happens. You can see how this is very much directed at a school age audience, and it was performed very often by schools. And so that is how the poem reaches audiences in a different iteration through music. There are also musical gestures throughout Aguilar's score. After she's eaten the fruit, Laura starts singing with the goblins, singing the same tune as the goblins, thus merging musically with them. And this is a sign of how much she has internalized the goblin perspective. And then when Laura returns home to Lizzie, Lizzie and Laura sing a duet that sonically suggests their different inner states. They're now simultaneously singing different words set to two melodic lines that move independently, tonally and rhythmically. Thus, music extends and reinforces textual meaning. And that's what we see over and over again in these adaptations. So Emmanuel Aguilar was given exclusive rights to set Goblin Market, and those exclusive rights expired at 1900. So this is the only Victorian setting of Goblin Market. But then in 1904, Vittorio Ricci publishes his musical setting of Goblin Market. And this includes a translation into German, which, to the best of my knowledge, is the first translation of this major poem into German. Next, though, we have another fascinating mid-20th century setting. This one is the first female composer. This isn't the right slide yet. It's okay. This one is by Ruth Gibbs, the first female to set this poem. And it is the first feminist reading of Goblin Market. In 1954, it anticipates the literary recuperation of Rossetti, which was undertaken in the 1970s from a feminist literary perspective. But Gibbs does it first. And what Gibbs does is she focuses on the sisters' felt experience rather than on the moral reading of that experience or on Laura's social recovery. Gibbs deletes the poem's ending, where Laura is clearly a wife and mother, as she offers a moral interpretation of her experience to the gathered children. Moving on again, in 1985, there was an award-winning off-Broadway play of Goblin Market by Polly Penn and Peggy Harmon. And this now takes the poem into music theater. They also introduce new materials, a retrospective narrative framework, and they situate the action as a psychodrama in which the goblins and their tempting fruits are not real in the external world. They're generated by the girls themselves, now grown women, from their own imaginations and memories. Moreover, we now have other Rossetti poems integrated into the play. And so her poem Mirage, Passing Away from Old and New Year Ditties, and Song, Two Doves Upon the Self Same Branch, move into textual relation with Goblin Market, which is a legitimate critical move because Rossetti did carefully sequence her poems within her volumes. Now we can move on to that other musical score. This is by Joseph Klein. It's a 1993 setting, and it's experimental, as you may be able to see. This was the adaptation for solo trumpet and prepared piano. And it's a fascinating one. Next, in 1995, we have Aaron J. Kernis's setting of Goblin Market. And it's an impressive setting. For this, he writes this for narrator and large ensemble, and it's an impressive major work in which a dramatic reading, and it's a reading, not a sung version, a reading of the unaltered and unabridged poem is precisely notated rhythmically in the musical score. What we've done here is condensed the text so you can read it in its rhythmical form, but in the full text, you have all of the orchestra laid out above it and one line of text going through the middle, I think. This notation could very well be the most detailed and sustained interpretation of the poem's irregular meter that it's had to date. And the meter was a big issue. John Ruskin said, you've got to learn to write standard meter or you're never going to have any success as a poet. So the irregular meter was a big part of the poem's specialness right from the outset. Kernis also uses instruments to define and identify characters. Laura is a viola, Lizzie's a violin, and the goblins primarily woodwinds. I skipped over some things. One of the things I wanted to illustrate here is how illustration, music, and text can sometimes intertwine in creating the reading of the poem, because Kernis didn't encounter Goblin Market as a simple text. He encountered it in an illustrated version by Lawrence Houseman. And this illustrated version of Lawrence Houseman was a darker, more grotesque, and more sexualized version of Rossetti's poem. It was a pictorial representation that Rossetti herself disliked, but Kernis's setting demonstrates a fascinating intertwining of text, illustration, and music. And so given that Kernis's music for Goblin Market expresses an interpretation of the poem that aligns with Houseman's, we can now see a line of influence from text to image to music. The original performance of this, it was a commissioned work, also included a mime. And the very modern interpretation of the poem presents the story in terms of modern realities like teenage pregnancy, delinquency, drug addiction, and AIDS, while at the same time keeping some components of the Victorian ethos with girls in sheet white dresses and long hair. And the Goblin's Mask present a dark and threatening version of the goblins, which comes from the illustrated versions. And it's not just Houseman's that appears, that's the program. The first illustration we see there, that's the program. And that kind of draws, the left banner is Dante Gabriel Rossetti's illustration from the original publication. And the puppets are kind of based on Arthur Rackham's vision of the goblins. The poem, the song, the setting also has a darker ending. Curtis reminds us, though Rossetti's poem does not, that temptation and darkness always threaten. Curtis's final mischievous sounding woodwind passage recalls the goblins who charm and tempt with their luscious and seductive fruits, rather than the darker, threatening, and dissonant sound associated with them in more fraught moments of the poem. Though the woodwinds are playful sounding now, the deadly peril that the goblins and their fruits bring remains very fresh in the listener's minds. And so this is the final musical gesture of the whole work. This final burst of goblin energy and full woodwind sound suggests that the goblin threat has only been temporarily overcome. Their seductive danger will persist to tempt other maidens. There's another musical theater adaptation more recently by Kath Burlinson and Connor Mitchell. And this adaptation emphasizes the youthfulness of the sisters in contrast to Polly Penn and Peggy Harmon's. A former academic and Christina Rossetti scholar herself, Kath Burlinson brings a lot of specialized knowledge to her script. She creates a script that brings Goblin Market into relation with Rossetti's fictional work, Speaking Likenesses, and really examines the social forces that shape female identity. This poem has been moved to many different social settings. It's been moved to Depression era, the American South and the Appalachians. And there's been combinations of Goblin Market with ballet, film, puppetry, opera, and a Cirque du Soleil style circus theater that I managed to see in Montreal, and it was fascinating. So this poem has really opened up to a lot of different possibilities in performance and in the musical world. But it's also opened up, Christina Rossetti's poem has opened up the musical world itself, has played a vital role in it. As I've said, I don't know if I've already said it yet, actually. Maura Ives's bibliography demonstrates that by 1900, there were 172 musical settings. When we look at those, what we find is that over 40% were written by female composers. To put this into context, at the beginning of the 19th century, it was generally understood that women were simply not intellectually equipped to ever write music. And yet by 1900, 40% of the women writing music for Christina Rossetti poems were female composers. And these were leading female composers of the day: Alice Mary Smith, Caroline Reinagle, Virginia Gabriel, Agnes Zimmerman, Mary Grant Carmichael, and Maud Valerie White. Sadly, since the deaths of these female composers, their works have been languishing in neglect. So there is a huge opportunity here now to start retrieving and recovering the works of these female composers. There's scholarly opportunity here. Another composer whose work was significant in Christina Rossetti's settings, but whose work has fallen into neglect until recently, is Samuel Coleridge Taylor. He was the son of an English mother and an African father who was in London studying medicine and became a doctor. But then he returned to Africa as he was encountering racial prejudice in his medical practice in England. Samuel Coleridge Taylor was raised by his grandparents and his mother, and he was a very talented musician. And he was accepted to the Royal College of Music, where he studied and worked alongside people like Ray Vaughan Williams, Gustav Holst. Edward Elgar became a supporter of his. He was integrated into the core musical, the core of the musical scene of the period. He necessarily, he looks ethnically different from most of the people who were at the Royal College of Music. And although he had many opportunities, he became increasingly aware of racial bias. He was invited to go to the United States to tour there. And while he was in the United States, he was invited to the White House for dinner. He was the first person of color to conduct a white orchestra in performance. He had huge opportunities, and he became much more politicized, became part of the Pan-African movement, started reading important race theory by people like W.E.B. Du Bois. And there he encounters knowledge and more information about his African musical heritage. And around this time, he writes 6 sorrow songs, which was settings of 6 different Christina Rossetti lyrics. Naively, I thought the sorrow songs was a reference to the typically lamenting tone of Rossetti's poems, which are very often about loss, death, mourning. But in fact, sorrow songs has a musical meaning as well. As a musicology student at the University of Ottawa, Saida Rajabzadeh has discovered. She has been looking at 6 sorrow songs and discovered that Du Bois, whose book Samuel Coleridge Taylor read in the year leading up to this composition, whose book reveals that sorrow songs is another word for slave songs, spirituals, and African folk songs. What Coleridge Taylor does is he very creatively and sometimes subtly blends the genres of art song and sorrow song as he maps sorrow songs' rhythmical elements, including drum calls, polyrhythm, and weak beat accents into these art songs that would then be performed on the English concert stage. This is a huge breakthrough culturally and musically in the English art song tradition. And I'm thrilled that this musicology graduate student, under the direction of both Jada and myself, has discovered this and will bring this to light. This has just received its first, I think, CD release by opera star Elizabeth Llewellyn, and it's wonderful. It's called Heart and Hereafter. Take a look at it if you can. Okay, so I think I'll stop there, Roxanne, and let you take it away again.
Okay, so we're just going to end, because we are approaching the end here. A list of our challenges, and I'm going to talk about the first 2, and Mary will take over the last 2. So metadata consistency is key. Now, it's funny, when I was practicing doing this talk, I realized I kept using the word time, and I realized, you know, actually our biggest challenge is time. We just don't have enough time to do all of this. But we do when we can, and it grows slowly, not as fast as we would have liked to, but it's getting there. And we learn so much along the way. So the metadata is key here, especially if we want to start analyzing it. And there are some areas that are more problematic than others. For instance, genre. So we have a list of genre, but there are times where it's really hard to sort of delineate what is sacred and what is not sacred music, or what is considered choral music, opposed to an ensemble. Like, these are the things that our catalogers get very confused about, and with reason, because I keep sending emails to the team saying, what do you think? I think it should be this. A lot of these settings, when you look at the vendors who sell these scores, they often promote it in some way, and they'll say, oh, this is perfect for youth choirs. And but do we constitute it children's music? So these are the things that I think become a little problematic. And then there are the things that are omitted. It's not that what's there is wrong, is that not everything was actually selected. And that happens a lot as well. So there's a lot of work to be done there, but we do the best we can. The other thing is that when we catalog something, we don't necessarily have the score right away. And we might never have the score, but later we've had scores like 2 years after we started the record, and then we have to go clean up the record or supplement the record. And so this never ends. And then we'll find things online that a scholar started writing about a particular setting, and we have extra information. So it's an ongoing thing. So we do the best we can with what we have at the time, but there's always improvements to be done. So if you ever notice something that's wrong or should be added to a setting, let us know. Communication is key here. The other aspect is the data management and preservation. And I'm sure any one of you who have done any digital project or any research really is, how do you manage all those files and all that information? We have guides, we have, we seem really organized. But the one thing that's always a hurdle is making sure that we have the copies of those scores or that material elsewhere as a backup. So yes, it's put on JSTOR Forum, so that's one place, but only one score or one file is there. If we have versions of that, they happen to be only in Omeka. So the original is in both, and then in Omeka it has extra. Well, that's just one place. So recently we deleted an item by mistake, and when it's gone, it's gone. And so we realized that we didn't have the other version. It was an Omeka, I think it was an Omeka item that we had deleted by mistake. And so we had to backtrack, and I didn't have it, and the assistant didn't have it, because we realized it was a previous assistant that had cataloged it. And thankfully, Mary had a copy of it, but it was the only copy. So we really had to set up a system, and we've just done this summer, and there's a lot of work to be done. But at least we know that most of the copies, we have more than one place for them. We just need to amalgamate them all in one other portal. And then a hard drive, which I seem to be the one managing it because I have it next to my desk. So when the pandemic hit, I grabbed the laptop and I grabbed that. So we're all set to go. And that's basically what I have to say about that. We could have a whole talk just about these things, but I just thought I would mention that because I think it's the type of thing that every investigator has to cope with. So Mary, you want to go with the other two?
Yeah, sure. Expanding the archives. We know that we don't have everything that is in existence. And one of the biggest barriers for us is language, because we don't really have the skill set to go through a library catalog in Russian or in a lot of other different languages. And Christina Rossetti's poetry has been set in a whole range of languages. And I don't think I've read them out yet, but I mean, we're talking like English, German, French, Italian, Welsh, Dutch, Norwegian, Chinese, Japanese, Swedish, Catalan, Afrikaans. I mean, it's everywhere, and we don't speak most of these languages. So we would be so grateful if any of you have language abilities that extend beyond English and French. We'd be so grateful if you just happen to have a resource in your town or city that you could search and share with us some scores that we would not find on our own. And so expanding the archives, the first thing I want to say is we're willing to expand the team. We want to open this to anybody's participation. Just this past summer, I got a wonderfully welcome email from somebody who works at a radio station in Iceland and pointed out to us that she come across a manuscript of a setting of When I'm Dead, My Dearest by the Icelandic composer who wrote the national anthem for Iceland. And so would we have ever found that in the National Archives? No. It's that kind of offer of information that we want to open ourselves up to very, very enthusiastically and gratefully. So that's one thing. Also, if anybody becomes aware of a newly digitized musical archive, that's one of the moving targets we've become very aware of over the last few years, is that lots of places are digitizing their resources and making them available if they're in the public domain. But you kind of have to know where to look. And we don't spend most of our days searching the internet blindly. So if anybody comes upon a resource and can just fire us an email and let us know that it's there, we will harvest the scores and the data and everything we can from it. This is, I hope, going to be a larger scholarly community that is going to be interested in this topic. You have to start somewhere, but I think we're ready to grow this thing. And the other thing that ensuring the future of this never-ending project, we just want to recognize that Roxanne and I will both be retired within the next decade, and we will need, nobody on our team except Roxanne knows how to do a lot of the things that Roxanne knows. So we're going to need a real technical person to step into that role. And we really need to have a literary scholar as well to take over the lead of the project, somebody who really understands Rossetti criticism and scholarship. So if anybody sees this as part of their professional future, I would love to hear from you. One of the other things that we've noticed about the educational aspect of this project, as Roxanne said, we've started teaching it to undergraduate and graduate students, and it has led to employment for many of these students. Digital humanities, it became very apparent to me very quickly, it is a niche expertise that almost every university wants to bring into their departments. I can't tell you how many job listings, say expertise in digital humanities would be welcome. No matter what the field is, it has a place in scholarship now. As we move away from print, from really copyright limited material, there's a real interest in the kinds of projects the digital humanities facilitate. And I'm grateful for that. Okay, so I will stop talking. Thank you very much all for being here with us.
Thank you both very much. What a great way to kick off the year.
Thank you.
And I've been throwing stuff in the chat the whole time.
I haven't been reading yet.
Every time you mention it, I put it in the chat.
I did see those, yes.
So if you have questions, please don't hesitate to put them in the chat or in the Q&A. But I just want to thank you both for taking a tour of Christina Rossetti and music. And, I'm honored to be a collaborator on the team, and I look forward to getting down to work soon with you two.
Yes.
Hopefully in person.
That'd be nice.
Would be nice.
If we're all doubly vaccinated.
Yeah, absolutely. So while we'll just wait another minute to see if a question comes in, but I wanted to say thank you for emphasizing digital humanities so much. Your work, my work couldn't exist without having a digital humanities team here at the University of Ottawa. Our courses run thanks to the help of Roxanne in particular, but also Sarah Simkin and Anne Hemingway and others in the library. And this Toolbox series, which I love so much, is a great place to be having these discussions and sharing these projects. And I just want to say that our next session is October 20th. So 2 weeks from today, same time, 11:30 to 1 Eastern. And we're inviting somebody from Carleton, Patricia Berube from the Institute of Comparative Studies and Literature, is going to come and talk about the really cutting edge work she does in visual arts. So her talk is called Translating Visual Arts into Tactile and Multisensory Mediation Tools. And she's really interested in how to bring visual arts to individuals who have various levels of visual impairment. It's too bad we can't be in person because obviously this is a very tactile, but we also can't be touching things right now. So virtual it is. I'm very much looking forward to hosting that talk in 2 weeks, and I really hope that everyone joins us again then. And since we don't have any questions, how about we end it there and call it a successful first session of the year?
Thank you, Jada, for asking us. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you both very much. And thank you to our technician, Mike.
Yes, thank you, Mike.
Who's been here the whole time. So thank you, everybody. And we'll see you back again on October 20th. Have a great week.
Thanks. Have a good week, everybody. Bye.